The train lurched to a stop in a town that smelled of dust and broken promises, and Eliza Moore stepped onto a platform that should have marked the beginning of her new life. Instead, the station master's words hit her like a physical blow. Samuel Brennan? Ma'am, he was killed yesterday, kicked by a horse, died before sundown. 23 years old, orphaned twice in 1 year, and now stranded 2,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, with $6 in her reticule and a wedding dress folded in her trunk. The Colorado wind cut through her Boston wool like it knew she didn't belong here. Before we begin Eliza's journey from loss to love, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps me bring you more tales from the American frontier. Now let's step back to that dusty platform in 1875, where everything Eliza thought she knew was about to change forever. The afternoon sun beat down on Miller's Crossing with the kind of relentless heat that turned optimism into endurance. Eliza stood on the platform long after the other passengers had dispersed, her hands gripping the handle of her carpet bag until her knuckles went white. The station master, a wiry man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes that held more pity than she could bear, had already retreated into the shade of his office, leaving her alone with the terrible arithmetic of her situation. $6, a trunk full of belongings chosen for a life that would never happen, and a name that meant nothing now. Mrs. Samuel Brennan, a title she'd never worn and never would. The platform boards creaked under her feet as she turned slowly, taking in the town that was supposed to have been her salvation. Miller's Crossing wasn't much to look at, a single rutted street lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean toward each other like drunks sharing secrets. A general store, a saloon with painted windows, a church with a steeple that listed slightly to the left. Beyond the buildings, the land stretched out in shades of gold and brown, broken by dark stands of pine on distant hills and the jagged line of mountains against the western sky. It was nothing like Boston, nothing like the narrow streets and brick facades, the harbor bells and vendor calls, the ordered certainty of a world she'd understood. This place felt raw and unfinished, as if the earth itself hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be. "Ma'am?" Eliza turned to find a woman approaching from the direction of the general store. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and a calico dress that had been mended more times than it had been new. Her face was weathered but kind, creased with lines that spoke of smiles more than sorrows. "I'm Martha Yates," the woman said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I heard what happened. About Samuel Brennan. I'm terribly sorry." Eliza's throat tightened. She'd cried on the train in private moments when the clack of wheels covered the sound of her grief. But here, faced with this stranger's sympathy, she found she had no tears left. Only a hollow ache that seemed to take up all the space her hope had occupied just hours before. "Thank you," she managed. "I didn't know him. We'd only corresponded." Martha nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if she'd seen this story play out before. "You've come a long way to find yourself alone. Do you have people back east? Somewhere you can return to?" "No." The word came out harder than Eliza intended. She softened her tone, though the truth remained unchanged. "My parents passed last winter. Influenza. There's no one." "Any funds? Enough for lodging while you sort things?" $6. Eliza did the math without needing to. The boarding house she'd glimpsed from the train, the only one in town, would take most of that in a week. And then what? She had no skills that translated to this harsh place, no connections, no claim on anyone's charity. "Some," she said, which wasn't quite a lie. "I'll manage." But Martha's expression suggested she saw through the careful words to the desperation beneath. The older woman glanced over her shoulder, then back to Eliza with a considering look. "The boarding house is run by Vera Hutchins. She's got a spare room, but she'll want payment in advance. If you need work—" Martha hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Well, there aren't many respectable positions for unmarried women in a town this size. The saloon's always looking for girls, but I wouldn't recommend it, not for someone like you." Eliza's stomach turned at the implication. She'd heard stories about frontier saloons, about what happened to women who had nowhere else to turn. The very thought made her skin crawl. not from judgment, but from the cold recognition of how quickly circumstances could strip away every other choice. "I can keep books," she said quickly. "I manage my father's accounts for his importing business. I can read and write, do sums. Surely someone needs—" Folks here keep their own books, mostly. The ones who can't keep books can't afford to pay someone to do it for them. Martha's tone was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who'd learned not to traffic in false hope. "I'm not saying it's impossible, just that it might take time to find something suitable." Time. The one thing Eliza couldn't afford. A bell jangled as the door to the general store opened and a man emerged carrying a crate of supplies. He was tall and lean, dressed in work clothes faded from sun and washing, denim trousers, a homespun shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a hat that had seen better seasons. He moved with the economical grace of someone accustomed to hard physical labor, crossing the street toward a wagon hitched in front of the store. Martha raised her hand in greeting. "Caleb, a moment, if you've got it." The man, Caleb, settled the crate in the wagon bed and turned toward them. As he approached, Eliza got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face weathered by wind and sun. His features were unremarkable, taken individually: straight nose, strong jaw, eyes that might have been blue or gray in the harsh afternoon light, but together they formed something steadier than handsome. Reliable, she thought. The kind of face that didn't promise anything it couldn't deliver. Martha. He touched the brim of his hat, then glanced at Eliza with polite curiosity. "Ma'am?" "This is Eliza Moore," Martha said. "She's just arrived from Boston. She was meant to marry Samuel Brennan." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not pity exactly, but a quiet understanding that suggested he knew what loss looked like, and didn't believe in making a show of sympathy. "I heard about Samuel," he said. "That's a hard thing. I'm sorry for your trouble." "Thank you." Eliza kept her spine straight, her voice level. She would not break down in the middle of this dusty street in front of strangers, would not give in to the panic clawing at the edges of her composure. Martha stepped forward, lowering her voice, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "Caleb, Miss Moore finds herself in difficult circumstances. No family to return to, limited funds. I was thinking—" She paused, as if weighing how far she could push. "Your place could use some tending. Since Rebecca passed, you've been managing alone, and Miss Moore here can keep books, handle household accounts. It would be proper. She'd have her own space, her own door, just until she finds her footing." Eliza's cheeks burned. The humiliation of having her desperation discussed so openly, of being presented like a charity case to this stranger, made her want to gather her belongings and walk into the wilderness rather than endure another moment of this. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, so she stood silent and kept her gaze fixed on the mountains in the distance. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When Eliza finally made herself look at him, she found him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Thoughtful, cautious, neither eager nor dismissive. "That's a serious proposition, Martha," he said finally. "Not something to decide standing in the street." "I know it." Martha's voice carried a note of gentle insistence. "But the girl needs help, and you need help. Seems to me that's how things work out here. People helping each other because that's the only way any of us survive." Caleb's gaze shifted back to Eliza. "You have any experience with ranch work? Cooking, cleaning, mending?" "I managed a household in Boston," Eliza said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "Not a ranch, but I'm capable of learning. I don't shirk work, Mr. Turner. Caleb Turner." He took off his hat, turned it in his hands. "I run a cattle operation about 5 miles west of town. Small spread, just me and a couple of hands during calving season. The house needs work. I won't lie about that. It's been neglected since my wife died 3 years back." The mention of his wife, Rebecca, Martha had called her, settled something in Eliza's mind. This wasn't a bachelor looking for companionship under the guise of employment. This was a widower who understood loss, offering practical help to someone who needed it. "I'm not afraid of work," she said, "or neglect. What I need is honest employment and a roof that doesn't come with expectations I can't meet." Something that might have been respect flickered across Caleb's face. "Fair enough. I can offer room and board, separate quarters in the house, and $20 a month for managing the household, cooking, cleaning, mending, basic bookkeeping if you're as good with numbers as Martha says. Work starts at dawn, ends at dusk. Nothing improper, nothing expected beyond what I've named. You'd have Sundays free, and I'd bring you to town anytime you needed. If you find better prospects or decide ranch life isn't to your liking, you're free to leave with 2 weeks' notice either way. $20. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. More importantly, it was survival. Time to breathe, to think, to figure out what came next. I accept, Eliza said, before she could talk herself out of it. When would you want me to start? Now's as good as any time. I've got supplies to load, then we can head out before dark. Caleb looked to Martha. You'll vouch for my character, won't you? So Miss Moore knows she's not taking up with some scoundrel? Martha smiled. Caleb Turner's the most honest man in this territory. He'll keep his word, Miss Moore. You can trust that much. Trust. Eliza had trusted Samuel Brennan's letters, trusted that Boston's familiar sorrows could be left behind for Colorado's promised fresh start. Look where trust had brought her. But what choice did she have? This stranger's offer was the only lifeline in sight, and she was drowning. Then we have an agreement, she said, extending her hand the way her father had taught her, firm, direct, meeting the other person's eyes. Caleb took her hand in his. His palm was calloused, his grip careful but strong. Agreement, then. Welcome to the Turner Ranch, Miss Moore. The ride out to the ranch was mostly silent. Caleb drove the wagon with steady hands, navigating ruts and rocks with the unconscious skill of someone who'd made this journey 1,000 times. Eliza sat beside him on the bench, her trunk secured in the back with the supplies, her carpet bag clutched in her lap. The town fell away behind them, replaced by endless rolling grassland dotted with sage and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking where water ran. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. Caleb didn't seem like a man who needed to fill empty air with empty words, but Eliza found herself acutely aware of every detail, the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, the way Caleb's hands rested easy on the reins as if he and the horses had reached an understanding long ago. How long have you had the ranch? She asked finally, more to ground herself in something concrete than from burning curiosity. 12 years. Built the house and the barn with my own hands. Bought cattle with money I'd saved from working other men's spreads. His voice was low and even, matter of fact. It's not much, but it's mine. Or it will be, once I pay off the loan at the bank. Martha mentioned your wife. Rebecca. He said the name without hesitation, but something in his tone suggested old grief, worn smooth by time. She took sick 4 winters back. Fever. There wasn't anything to be done. A pause. She was the one who made the house a home. Since she passed, it's been more of a place to sleep between work. Eliza nodded, understanding more than he'd said. Loss carved out spaces inside people, left them with rooms they didn't know how to fill anymore. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Appreciate it. Caleb glanced at her, then back to the road. I know it's not the same as what you're facing, losing someone you knew versus someone you'd planned to know. But I figure loneliness feels about the same either way. The observation was unexpectedly perceptive, and it loosened something in Eliza's chest. Yes, she said, it does. They rode on. The land changed subtly as they traveled. The grass grew longer, the sage thicker. A creek appeared on their left, winding through the valley with stands of willow marking its course. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Is it always this quiet? Eliza asked. Mostly. Towns where people go for noise. Out here it's just wind and cattle and your own thoughts. Caleb shifted the reins. You get used to it. Some folks even come to prefer it. Eliza wasn't sure she'd be one of those folks, but she kept that thought to herself. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a collection of buildings nestled in a valley where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods. The house was small, built of rough-hewn logs with a covered porch across the front. The barn was larger, solid-looking, with a corral attached. A few other outbuildings dotted the property, chicken coop, smokehouse, what might have been a root cellar. It wasn't much, as Caleb had said, but it was well kept in the ways that mattered. Fences mended, roofs intact, nothing falling to ruin. The work of a man who took care of what was his. "That's home," Caleb said simply. "Such as it is." He pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake. Before Eliza could gather herself, he'd jumped down and come around to offer his hand. She took it, grateful for the steadiness as she navigated the step down in her traveling dress. The porch boards were weathered but sound. Caleb pushed open the front door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was dim after the bright afternoon, and it took Eliza's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space combined. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking stove set up beside it. Rough-built shelves held provisions and dishes. A table with 2 chairs sat beneath a window that looked out toward the barn. Everything was functional, spare, and covered with a fine layer of dust that spoke of months, years, of benign neglect. "There's 2 bedrooms through that door," Caleb said, pointing to the back of the house. "You'll take the smaller one. It's got a window and a decent bed. I sleep in the other. There's a bolt on your door for privacy. No one's going to bother you here." Eliza nodded, taking it all in. It was more than she'd had any right to expect: shelter, employment, safety. The rest she'd figure out as she went. "I'll bring your trunk in," Caleb continued. "Then I need to see to the horses and check on the cattle. There's food in the larder: bread, cheese, some dried beef. Help yourself to whatever you need. We'll talk more about the household arrangements tomorrow." He left before she could thank him, the door closing softly behind him. Eliza stood alone in the silent house, listening to the creak of the wagon as Caleb drove it toward the barn. This was it then, the life she'd traveled 2,000 miles to claim, utterly transformed from what she'd imagined. No wedding, no husband, no certainty. Just a dusty house in the middle of nowhere, and a quiet stranger who'd offered her a chance because someone had asked him to, and he was too decent to refuse. Eliza set down her carpet bag and walked slowly through the main room, trailing her fingers along the table's edge. Dust came away on her gloves. She moved to the shelves, noted the limited supplies, the haphazard organization. The kitchen stove was cold, the wood box nearly empty. In the bedroom Caleb had indicated, she found a narrow bed with a straw mattress, a small dresser, and a washstand with a chipped basin. The window looked out over the creek and the cottonwoods, golden green in the late afternoon light. A peg on the wall held a faded quilt. It wasn't much, but it was hers, at least for now. Eliza removed her gloves, unpinned her hat, set both on the dresser. Then she sat down on the bed and let herself feel the full weight of everything that had happened: the loss, the fear, the desperate leap into uncertainty. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that. Instead, she straightened her spine, smoothed her skirts, and went back out to the main room to see what needed doing. Because if there was one thing Eliza Moore knew how to do, it was survive. By the time Caleb returned to the house, twilight had begun to soften the harsh edges of the day. He found Eliza at the kitchen stove, coaxing heat from a fire she'd built with wood from the lean-to outside. The smell of coffee filled the room, real coffee, not the chicory blend he'd been making do with. "You didn't have to," he started. "I needed something to do with my hands," Eliza said without turning around. "And you'll want supper, I assume?" "I'm used to making my own." "I'm sure you are. But we have an arrangement now, and part of that arrangement is me managing the household." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Unless you'd prefer to renegotiate on the first day." There was steel in her voice beneath the politeness, and Caleb found himself almost smiling. "No, ma'am. I'll leave you to it." He washed up at the pump outside, then came back in to find the table set with 2 plates, 2 cups of coffee, and a simple meal of fried salt pork, beans, and the last of the bread from town. It wasn't fancy, but it was more than he'd bothered with in longer than he cared to admit. They ate in silence for a while. Caleb was used to eating alone, and he didn't mind quiet. But after a few minutes, he realized Eliza was studying the room with the focused attention of someone making mental lists. "What?" he asked. "I'm assessing what needs doing," she said. "The house requires a thorough cleaning. The shelves need organizing. That window," she pointed to one near the door, "has a crack that should be sealed before winter, and you're low on basic supplies. How often do you go to town?" Once a month, usually, more if something comes up. We'll need to go more frequently if I'm to keep a proper household. Weekly, at least at first. Caleb considered this. Town meant time away from work, but it also meant Eliza wouldn't be stranded out here with no connection to civilization. That seemed fair. Saturdays, he said. We can make it a regular thing. You can get whatever supplies you need, and I'll settle accounts at the store. Agreed. Eliza took a sip of her coffee. I'll make a list tonight of what's most urgent. They finished the meal without further conversation. Caleb found himself oddly aware of her presence, the quiet efficiency of her movements, the way she held herself with careful dignity despite the circumstances. She wasn't what he'd expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected when Martha had suggested this arrangement. When the dishes were cleared and washed, Eliza excused herself to her room. Caleb heard the bolt slide home. Not an accusation, just a woman taking the precautions any sensible person would in unfamiliar surroundings. He sat alone by the dying fire, coffee cup in hand, and tried to remember the last time he'd shared a meal with someone. Months, probably. Maybe longer. The house felt different with someone else in it. Not worse, not better, just different. He'd meant what he'd told Eliza. The arrangement was strictly practical, nothing improper expected or offered. But sitting here in the dim light with the taste of real coffee on his tongue and the knowledge that someone else was breathing in the next room, Caleb had to admit that loneliness felt a little less heavy than it had that morning. Eliza's first week at the Turner Ranch passed in a blur of exhausting work. She woke before dawn each morning, built up the fire, and started coffee before Caleb emerged from his room. She cooked breakfast, simple fare at first, limited by the supplies on hand, but filling and hot. After Caleb left to tend the cattle and fences, she attacked the house with a determination that bordered on fury. Years of dust came off the shelves, the table, the windowsills. She swept and scrubbed, aired out blankets, beat rugs until her arms ached. The work was endless and exhausting, but it was also grounding. Each surface cleaned, each cobweb removed, each corner made fresh felt like reclaiming something, not just the house, but herself. Caleb kept his distance during the day, coming in only for meals and the occasional drink of water. He didn't comment on the changes taking shape around him, but Eliza caught him looking sometimes, at the organized shelves, the clean windows, the table set for supper, with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. On Saturday, true to his word, he hitched the wagon and took her to town. "Make your list," he said as they approached Miller's Crossing. "Get what you need. Within reason." Within reason meant Eliza had to prioritize ruthlessly. Flour, sugar, salt, lard, coffee, dried beans, a few yards of muslin for curtains and dish towels. The general store proprietor, a cheerful man named Henderson, tallied everything up while making small talk about the weather and the upcoming church social. "You're staying out at Turner's place, I hear," Henderson said, wrapping Eliza's purchases in brown paper. "Yes." Eliza kept her voice level, braced for judgment, but Henderson just nodded approvingly. "Good man, Caleb. Honest as they come. You're in good hands." The casual acceptance surprised her. In Boston, a young unmarried woman living on a bachelor's property, even with separate quarters, would have sparked endless gossip. Here, it seemed, necessity trumped propriety. They were loading the wagon when Martha Yates appeared, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Miss Moore, I'd hoped I'd see you." Martha glanced at Caleb, who was securing the supplies. "How are you settling in?" "Well enough," Eliza said. "Mr. Turner's been—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Proper." "Told you he would be." Martha handed her the basket. "I brought you some eggs for my chickens and a jar of preserves. Welcome gift." The kindness of it, the simple, uncomplicated generosity, made Eliza's throat tight. "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." "We look after each other out here," Martha said. "That's how it works. You need anything, you come find me. Understand?" Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. On the ride back to the ranch, she sat with the basket in her lap, feeling the warmth of the eggs through the cloth. Caleb didn't ask what Martha had said, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was pleased his character had been vouched for. The second week brought a rhythm to their days. Eliza rose early, started breakfast, kept the house in order. She mended Caleb's shirts, darned his socks, organized the root cellar. In the afternoons, when the worst of the day's heat had passed, she tackled larger projects, scrubbing the floor until the boards showed their grain again, washing every dish and glass in the house, airing out the mattresses. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, tending cattle, mending fences, managing the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. He was quiet by nature, but Eliza began to notice small things. The way he always took off his hat when he came inside, the care he took not to track mud across her clean floors, the fact that he never left dishes for her to deal with, but washed his own cup and plate if she wasn't immediately available. They spoke little at first, their conversations limited to practical matters. What supplies were running low? When the wagon needed a wheel greased, whether the fence on the north pasture could wait another week for repair. But slowly, carefully, like two cautious animals circling toward trust, they began to share more. It started one evening over supper. Caleb had come in late, dusty and tired, and Eliza had kept his meal warm by the stove. As she set the plate before him, he'd looked up at her with something like gratitude. "This is better than anything I've managed in 3 years," he said quietly. "I don't think I've told you that." "It's only stew." "It's more than that." He paused, choosing words. "The house feels lived in again. I didn't realize how much I'd let it go until you started fixing it." Eliza sat down across from him with her own plate. "A house needs tending like anything else. Neglect it long enough, and it stops being a home." Rebecca used to say something similar. Caleb's voice was steady, but his gaze had gone distant. She was good at making things feel settled, peaceful. After she died, I just couldn't bring myself to care about curtains or clean windows or any of it. "Grief does that," Eliza said softly. "Takes the color out of things." "You sound like you know." "I do." She set down her fork. "My mother died first, influenza. Then my father a month later, same thing. It was like watching a light go out twice. After the second funeral, I couldn't stand to be in that house anymore. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost." Caleb nodded slowly. "That's when you answered Samuel Brennan's advertisement." "Yes. I thought I could start over. Become someone new in a new place." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Instead, I arrived to find that my future had died before I even got here." "But you stayed." "I had nowhere else to go." Eliza met his eyes. "And you offered me a chance when you didn't have to. That matters." Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding of two people who'd both lost something irretrievable and were trying to figure out how to keep living anyway. After that, their conversations came easier. Caleb told her about the ranch, about building it from nothing with his own hands and Rebecca's help. He spoke of cattle drives and harsh winters, of the year the creek flooded and nearly took the barn, of small victories that meant everything when you were fighting to make a life from raw land. Eliza told him about Boston, about her father's importing business, and the world of ships and manifests and ledgers. She described the harbor, the cobblestone streets, the way fog rolled in from the Atlantic on autumn mornings. She didn't talk much about her parents' deaths. That wound was still too fresh, but she painted pictures of the life she'd known before loss had rewritten everything. They were careful with each other, never pushing too hard, never asking questions that felt too personal. But in the spaces between work and sleep, over meals and evening coffee, they were building something fragile and tentative, the beginning of understanding. Well, 3 weeks into Eliza's tenure at the ranch, a storm rolled in from the mountains. She'd seen it building all afternoon, dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, the wind picking up until the cottonwoods bent and whispered. By the time Caleb came in for supper, the first drops were falling, fat and heavy, darkening the dust in the yard. "Going to be a hard one," he said, hanging his hat by the door. "You'll want to close the shutters and make sure nothing's loose outside." Eliza had already secured the chickens and brought in firewood, but she helped Caleb bar the shutters as the storm intensified. Thunder rolled across the valley, so deep she felt it in her chest. Lightning split the sky, turning everything stark white for an instant before plunging back into darkness. They ate by lamplight as rain hammered the roof and wind howled around the corners of the house. It should have been frightening. Eliza had never experienced a storm like this, so wild and vast. But somehow, with the solid walls around her and Caleb's steady presence across the table, she felt safe. "Does it storm like this often?" she asked, raising her voice to be heard over the thunder. "Few times a summer, sometimes hail comes with it, ruins crops. But we need the rain, so you take what comes." Caleb glanced at the ceiling as a particularly violent gust shook the house. "This one's fiercer than most, though." The storm raged for hours. After supper, they sat by the fire, Eliza mending by lamplight, Caleb working on a piece of harness that needed repair. The domestic scene felt oddly comfortable, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. Around midnight, the wind finally began to ease. The rain continued, softer now, a steady drumming on the roof that was almost soothing. Eliza set aside her mending and stretched, feeling the ache in her shoulders from hunching over needlework. "I should turn in," she said. "Morning comes early." Caleb looked up from the harness. "Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his tone made her pause. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came west," he said. "I know you're making the best of hard circumstances, but I want you to know you're not a burden here. The work you're doing, the way you've brought this place back to life, it matters. I'm grateful for it." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You're paying me. That's the arrangement." "It's more than the arrangement." Caleb set down the harness, met her eyes. "You didn't have to care about this place. You could have done the minimum and counted the days until you could leave. But you haven't. You've put your heart into it, and it shows. I wanted you to know that I see it." She didn't know what to say. Gratitude was one thing. She'd been thanked before, by employers and family alike. But this felt different, more personal, as if Caleb saw past the work to the person doing it and appreciated both. "Thank you," she managed finally. "That means more than you might think." They stood there in the firelight, the storm gentling outside, and something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the change between winter and spring, too gradual to point to any single moment, but undeniable in its cumulative effect. Eliza excused herself to her room, but she lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain and thinking about the quiet man on the other side of the wall. Thinking about how strangeness was becoming familiarity, how loneliness was slowly transforming into something else entirely. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she could feel it growing, tender and uncertain, like the first green shoots after a long winter. The next morning dawned clear and washed clean, the storm's violence replaced by a crystalline calm. Eliza woke to find Caleb already gone, off to assess any damage to fences or cattle. She went through her morning routine, fire, coffee, breakfast, but her mind kept circling back to the previous night's conversation. "You've put your heart into it, had she?" Eliza paused, hands in the dishwater, and considered the question honestly. When she'd accepted Caleb's offer, it had been pure desperation, survival, nothing more. But somewhere in the weeks since, something had changed. The house had become more than just shelter. The work had become more than just employment. She'd started to care. It was dangerous, that caring. It put down roots, made leaving harder. And Eliza had no illusions about her situation. This was temporary, a way station until she figured out what came next. Caleb had made no promises beyond room, board, and wages. She'd be a fool to mistake his kindness for anything more than basic human decency. But still, she couldn't deny what she felt when she looked around the transformed house, or when Caleb came in tired and dusty and his face softened just a fraction at the sight of a hot meal waiting. She couldn't deny the small spark of something warm and alive that kindled in her chest when he said her name. Eliza dried the last dish and set it on the shelf. Outside, she could see Caleb riding back toward the house, his horse picking its way through puddles left by the storm. He sat easy in the saddle, at home in his body and his world, in a way that made Eliza, still finding her footing in this harsh landscape, feel both envious and admiring. He dismounted and came inside, bringing the smell of wet earth and horse with him. "Damage?" Eliza asked. "One section of fence down, but nothing I can't fix. Cattle came through fine." He poured himself coffee, added sugar from the bowl Eliza had set out. "Creek's running high, though. We'll need to be careful crossing it for the next few days." "I'll remember that." Caleb leaned against the counter, studying her over the rim of his cup. You sleep all right? Storm didn't keep you up? I slept fine. Eliza busied herself with wiping down the already clean table. It was louder than storms back east, but not frightening. Good. A pause. I meant what I said last night about being grateful. I know. Eliza met his gaze. I'm grateful too, for the chance you gave me when you didn't have to. Something in Caleb's expression shifted, became more open, more vulnerable. I'm starting to think maybe it wasn't just for you. Maybe I needed someone here as much as you needed to be here. The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Eliza felt her heart beat a little faster, felt the warm thing in her chest grow a little brighter. Maybe, she said softly. Maybe we both needed this. Caleb nodded, finished his coffee, set the cup in the basin. I should get to that fence. But Eliza? Yes? I'm glad you stayed. He left before she could respond, but Eliza stood in the middle of the kitchen with her hands pressed to her flushed cheeks, feeling something dangerous and wonderful unfurling inside her. She was glad she'd stayed too, and that terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. The weeks that followed the storm settled into a pattern that felt less like employment and more like partnership. Eliza found herself anticipating Caleb's return each evening, found her ears tuning to the sound of his boots on the porch, even when she was elbow-deep in bread dough or bent over the mending. She told herself it was merely the natural rhythm of shared household routines, but some deeper part of her knew the truth was more complicated. Summer deepened across the valley, turning the grass golden and filling the air with the scent of sun-warmed sage. Caleb worked long days preparing for the coming cattle drive, and Eliza expanded her role beyond the house. She began tending a small vegetable garden Rebecca had once planted, coaxing life from soil that had gone fallow. She learned to gather eggs without spooking the hens, to churn butter, to smoke meat in the small shed behind the house. The work was harder than anything she'd done in Boston, but it satisfied something in her she hadn't known existed. Each skill mastered, each task completed, felt like proof of her own capability, evidence that she could survive, even thrive, in this unforgiving place. One Saturday morning in late July, they made their weekly trip to town. The wagon rattled over the familiar ruts while Eliza reviewed her mental list of needed supplies. Beside her, Caleb drove with his usual quiet competence, but she caught him glancing at her more than once. "Something on your mind?" she asked finally. Caleb was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words. "There's a social at the church next Saturday. Folks gather for supper, dancing, that sort of thing. I was thinking," he paused, "I was thinking you might like to go. Get to know some of the women in town, have a break from ranch life." Eliza's first instinct was refusal. The thought of facing a room full of strangers, of fielding questions about her circumstances, and her presence at Caleb's ranch made her stomach tighten with anxiety. But another part of her, the part that had been lonely even in the midst of work, felt a small flutter of interest. "Would you go with me?" she asked. "Or would I be attending alone?" "I'd take you and stay." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "Not much for dancing, but I can manage conversation well enough, and it wouldn't be proper for you to go unescorted." The consideration behind the offer touched her. He wasn't pushing her toward socializing for his own benefit, but genuinely thinking of what she might need. "All right," Eliza said. "I'll go." A smile ghosted across Caleb's face, so brief she might have imagined it. "Good. That's good." They completed their errands in companionable silence. At the general store, Henderson greeted them like old friends and mentioned that his wife was looking forward to meeting Eliza at the social. At the feed store, the proprietor made a point of commenting on how well-kept Caleb's place looked these days, glancing at Eliza with approval. It was strange, Eliza thought as they loaded the wagon, how quickly she'd become part of the fabric of this small community. She was no longer the desperate stranger who'd arrived on that train platform, but someone people recognized, acknowledged, accepted. The transformation should have felt like relief, and it did. But it also carried weight. The more she belonged here, the harder it would be when circumstances inevitably changed. On the ride home, Caleb surprised her by breaking the silence first. "You ever think about what comes next? After here, I mean." The question landed heavily between them. Eliza had been carefully avoiding thinking too far ahead, living day to day because anything else felt too uncertain. "Sometimes," she admitted, But I don't have answers. I know I can't stay at your ranch indefinitely. It wouldn't be proper, and besides, you hired me as temporary help. But I also don't know what other options exist for a woman in my position. You could marry. Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. There are men in town who'd court you if you gave them the chance. Henderson's been widowed 2 years now. The banker's son is looking for a wife. You wouldn't lack for prospects. Something cold settled in Eliza's chest at the suggestion. The idea of courting some stranger, of entering into marriage out of necessity rather than genuine feeling, felt too much like the arrangement with Samuel Brennan, a transaction dressed up as partnership. "Is that what you think I should do?" she asked quietly. "I think you should do whatever makes you feel safe and settled." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "But I also think you deserve better than just safety. You deserve someone who sees what you're worth." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Eliza felt her pulse quicken, felt the dangerous warmth spreading through her chest again. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think about marrying again?" Caleb was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, finally, "I did once. Rebecca and I, we built something good together. After she died, I figured that was it for me. One chance at that kind of partnership. And I'd had mine. But lately," he trailed off, shook his head. "Lately I've been thinking maybe I was wrong about that." Eliza's breath caught. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to push past the careful neutrality of their conversation to something more honest. But fear held her back. Fear of misreading the situation, of risking the stability she'd found, of wanting something she couldn't have. So instead she said nothing, and they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that felt thick with everything they weren't saying. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Eliza stared at the ceiling and admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding for weeks. She cared for Caleb Turner, cared for him in ways that went far beyond gratitude or professional courtesy. She'd come to cherish their quiet conversations, the way his rare smiles transformed his weathered face, the steadiness he brought to every interaction. She'd come to anticipate his presence the way plants turn toward sunlight. But caring was dangerous. Caring meant vulnerability, meant the possibility of loss. And Eliza had lost enough already. She rolled onto her side, pulled the quilt close, and tried to convince herself that maintaining the careful boundaries of their arrangement was the wisest course. But her heart, stubborn and hopeful despite everything, refused to listen. The week leading up to the social passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Eliza threw herself into work with renewed intensity, as if staying busy could quiet the tumult of her thoughts. She pickled cucumbers from the garden, made soap, scrubbed every surface in the house until it gleamed. Caleb watched her with an expression that might have been concern but never commented, just quietly removed obstacles from her path and made sure she ate. On Friday evening, Eliza faced the contents of her trunk with growing dismay. She'd brought 3 dresses from Boston, her traveling dress, a simple day dress, and the wedding dress she'd never worn. The first 2 were practical but plain, made for work rather than socializing. The wedding dress was beautiful, cream silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, but wearing it felt wrong on every level. She was still staring at her limited options when a knock sounded at her door. "Eliza, you all right in there?" She opened the door to find Caleb holding a brown paper package tied with string. His expression was almost sheepish. "I was in town yesterday picking up some things," he said, "and I happened to mention to Martha Yates that you might need something suitable for the social. She sent this. Said it belonged to her daughter who's gone east and doesn't need it anymore." Eliza took the package with trembling hands. "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly—" "It's a gift, Eliza. Sometimes folks just want to help because it makes them feel good to do it. Let them." After he left, Eliza unwrapped the package to find a dress of deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers scattered across the fabric. It was simple but well made, with a fitted bodice and full skirt that would be perfect for an evening social. Tucked inside was a note in Martha's handwriting. "Every woman deserves to feel pretty sometimes. Enjoy yourself tomorrow. You've earned it." Eliza pressed the note to her chest, overwhelmed by the casual generosity of near strangers who'd claimed her as one of their own. In Boston, charity had always come with strings attached, with judgment and condescension. Here, it seemed, people helped each other simply because that's what you did. She tried on the dress and found it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, Eliza barely recognized the woman staring back. Her skin had tanned from hours working in the garden, her hands had grown calloused and capable, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd stepped off that train, a kind of quiet strength born from surviving and discovering she was more resilient than she'd known. Saturday arrived bright and clear. Eliza spent the morning helping Caleb with chores, then retreated to her room to prepare for the evening. She washed her hair, pinned it up carefully, and slipped into Martha's dress. When she emerged, she found Caleb waiting by the wagon, dressed in clean trousers and a white shirt she'd pressed earlier in the week. He'd shaved and combed his hair, and the transformation from dusty rancher to presentable gentleman was striking. His eyes widened when he saw her. "You look—" He cleared his throat. "That dress suits you." "Thank you." Eliza felt heat rising to her cheeks. "You clean up rather well yourself." The ride to town felt different from their usual weekly trips. There was a formality to it, an awareness that they were presenting themselves as a unit to the community. Caleb helped her down from the wagon with particular care, his hand lingering at her elbow, perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. The church social was being held in the town hall, a simple wooden building that served multiple purposes for Miller's Crossing's small population. As they approached, Eliza could hear music and laughter spilling through the open windows. Her stomach clenched with nervousness. "We don't have to stay long if you're not comfortable," Caleb said quietly, as if sensing her anxiety. "I'll be fine." Eliza straightened her spine, lifted her chin. She'd faced worse than a roomful of strangers. Inside, the hall was crowded with what seemed like the entire town. Families with children running underfoot, older folks claiming chairs along the walls, young people clustered in groups that shifted and reformed like water. Long tables held an impressive spread of food, and a small group of musicians was setting up in one corner. Martha Yates spotted them immediately and hurried over, her face bright with welcome. "Miss Moore? Oh, that dress looks lovely on you. I'm so glad you came." She turned to Caleb with a knowing smile. "And you brought an escort, very proper." "Martha," Caleb's tone was dry. "Don't start." "Start what? I'm simply observing that you two make a handsome couple." Before either could respond, Martha had taken Eliza's arm and was steering her toward a group of women. "Come meet the ladies. We've been dying to get to know you properly." Eliza shot a panicked glance back at Caleb, but he just gave her an encouraging nod and let Martha lead her away. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions. There was Henderson's wife, a warm woman named Clara, who immediately began sharing recipes. The school teacher, Miss Patricia Bloom, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who asked pointed questions about Eliza's education. The banker's wife, Mrs. Thornton, who was polite but reserved, clearly measuring Eliza against some internal standard. But most of the women were kind, genuinely interested in this newcomer who'd landed in their midst under such dramatic circumstances. They asked about Boston, about her journey west, about life at the Turner Ranch. Eliza answered carefully, aware that every word would be dissected and discussed later, but found herself relaxing as the conversation flowed. "It must be lonely out there," Clara Henderson said sympathetically. "Just you and Mr. Turner, miles from town." "The work keeps me busy," Eliza said, "and Mr. Turner is respectful. The arrangement is entirely proper." "Oh, we're not questioning that," Martha said quickly. "Caleb Turner is the most honorable man in this territory. But still, a young woman needs more than just work and propriety. She needs companionship, community." Before Eliza could respond, the musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began moving toward the center of the floor. She watched them with a mixture of longing and trepidation. She knew how to dance, had learned in Boston's more formal settings, but this looked wilder, more free. A shadow fell across her vision, and she looked up to find Caleb standing before her, one hand extended. "Dance with me?" he asked. Eliza's heart stuttered. "I'm not sure I know the steps for this kind of dancing." "I'll teach you. Come on." His hand was warm and calloused when she placed hers in it. He led her to the floor and drew her into the pattern of the dance, a reel, she thought, or something like it. The steps were simple once you understood the rhythm, and Caleb guided her through them with patient competence. "See," he said as they moved together, Not so different from anything else, just takes practice. Eliza found herself laughing, caught up in the music and movement. Around them, other couples swirled and spun, and the room felt alive with joy and energy. This was what community looked like, she realized. People coming together not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because shared celebration was its own kind of sustenance. When the dance ended, Caleb didn't immediately release her hand. They stood there in the middle of the floor, breathing hard, and something passed between them that felt like a question being asked without words. "Another one?" Caleb's voice was rough. "Yes," Eliza whispered. "Please." They danced 3 more sets before taking a break for refreshments. Eliza's feet ached and her face hurt from smiling, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so light. Caleb brought her punch, and they stood together at the edge of the room, watching the celebration continue around them. "Having a good time?" he asked. "Better than I expected." Eliza sipped her punch. "Thank you for bringing me." "My pleasure." He paused. "You fit here, Eliza, with these people, in this place. I hope you can see that." Before she could respond, a young man approached, tall and well-dressed, with an easy smile that suggested he was used to getting his way. "Miss Moore?" "I'm Thomas Thornton. My mother pointed you out and insisted I make your acquaintance." He cast a glance at Caleb. "Hope you don't mind me stealing her for a dance, Turner?" Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's up to Miss Moore." Both men looked at her expectantly. Eliza felt trapped between politeness and preference. Refusing would be rude, but accepting felt like a betrayal of the fragile something growing between her and Caleb. "One dance," she said finally. "If Mr. Turner doesn't object." "No objection," Caleb said, but his tone suggested otherwise. Thomas Thornton was a competent dancer and an enthusiastic conversationalist. He told Eliza about his work at his father's bank, about his plans to expand their holdings, about the fine house he was building on the edge of town. It was clear what he was doing, presenting himself as a prospect, making his suitability known. "I understand you're working for Turner," he said as they moved through the steps. "That must be quite an adjustment from city life." "It's different," Eliza allowed, "but not unpleasant. Still, a woman of your obvious refinement and education seems a waste to have you scrubbing floors and cooking meals for a bachelor rancher." His smile was charming, but held an edge. "You deserve better prospects, Miss Moore. I hope you'll allow me to call on you sometime. Properly, of course." Eliza felt anger flare in her chest at the casual dismissal of her work, of Caleb's character. "Mr. Turner has shown me nothing but respect and kindness when I had nowhere else to turn. That's worth more than fine prospects in my estimation." Thomas's smile faltered. "I didn't mean to offend. I was merely suggesting I know what you were suggesting." Eliza kept her voice level but firm. "And I appreciate your interest, but I'm not looking for suitors at present. If you'll excuse me." She pulled away before the dance ended and made her way back to where Caleb stood watching. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Ready to leave?" he asked quietly. "Yes." Eliza suddenly wanted nothing more than to be back at the ranch, away from appraising eyes and well-meaning questions. "Please." They made their goodbyes quickly. In the wagon, darkness settling around them, Caleb finally spoke. "Thornton make you uncomfortable?" He was presumptuous. Eliza kept her gaze on the stars beginning to emerge overhead. "Suggested I deserved better than working at your ranch." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "He might be right about that." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "He's not. What I have at your ranch, the work, the purpose, She paused, searching for the right words. "The sense of building something real. That matters more than whatever Thomas Thornton thinks is better." They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the creak of the wagon and the night songs of insects. Finally, as the ranch buildings came into view in the moonlight, Caleb spoke again. "I'm glad you turned him down." Eliza's heart beat faster. "Are you?" "Yes." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, but didn't immediately move to help her down. "Eliza, I need to be honest with you about something." She turned to face him, pulse racing. "What is it?" Caleb took off his hat, turned it in his hands, a gesture she'd come to recognize as him working up to something difficult. When I offered you work that first day, it was just that, an offer of employment because you needed help and I needed help. That's all I intended. I know, Eliza said quietly, but it's not just that anymore. Not for me. He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there took her breath away, hope and fear and longing all mixed together. These past weeks, having you here, talking with you, watching you bring life back to this place, it's made me realize how lonely I've been, how much I'd convinced myself I was fine, living half a life because the alternative seemed too hard. Eliza couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She'd hoped, but hoping and hearing were entirely different things. I know it's not fair to tell you this, Caleb continued. You came here for safety and employment, not for some widower's feelings. And I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated in any way. But I also can't keep pretending that what I feel is just gratitude or simple appreciation. He took a shaky breath. I care for you, Eliza. More than I should, probably. And if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I'd like to know. Because if there is, I'd like to court you properly. Not as employer and employee, but as a man who's hoping for a future with a woman he's come to admire and love. The last word hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful. Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing spoken what she'd been feeling but couldn't name. I do, she whispered. Feel the same. I have for weeks now, but I thought you were just being kind, that I was reading more into it than was there. Caleb's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. You weren't. It's there. It's been there since that night during the storm when I realized I didn't want you to leave, didn't want this arrangement to be temporary. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her, but this time, when his hand circled her waist to lift her down, he didn't immediately release her. They stood there in the moonlight, close enough that Eliza could feel the warmth of him, could count the quickened beats of his heart. So what happens now? She asked. Now, Caleb said softly. If you're willing, I'd like to court you properly. Take you to socials, let people see us together, give you time to be sure this is what you want. No pressure, no expectations beyond seeing where this might lead. And if at any point you change your mind, Eliza reached up and placed her fingers gently over his lips, silencing him. I won't change my mind. I came here expecting one future and found something completely different, something better. I'd be honored to be courted by you, Caleb Turner. His smile was like sunrise after a long night. Then with exquisite slowness, he lowered his head and kissed her, gentle and careful and full of promise. It was nothing like the passionate embraces in romantic novels, but it was real and honest and exactly right. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We should go inside, he murmured, before I forget to be proper. Eliza laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. Propriety is overrated. Maybe so, but you deserve to be courted right, and that's what I'm going to do. They went inside together, and though they retired to separate rooms as always, everything had changed. Eliza lay in her bed with her fingers pressed to her lips, replaying every word, every moment. She'd arrived in Colorado broken and desperate, expecting nothing but survival. Instead, she'd found hope. The morning after the social, Eliza woke to find the world transformed. Or perhaps it was only she who had changed, seeing everything through the lens of Caleb's confession and her own answering heart. Sunlight streamed through her window with what seemed like particular brilliance, and even the familiar sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens scratching in the yard, felt infused with new meaning. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons as her mind replayed the previous night. Caleb's words, his kiss, the careful promise they'd made to each other. It felt too fragile to be real, like morning frost that might vanish the moment she stepped outside. But when she emerged from her room, she found Caleb already at the stove, attempting to make coffee. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the smile that lit his face told her everything she needed to know. Last night had been real, and it hadn't evaporated with daylight. Morning, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. I was trying to let you sleep in after the late night, but I'm making a mess of the coffee. Eliza crossed to him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Let me help. They worked together in companionable silence, their movements coordinated from weeks of shared routine. But now there was an added awareness, a heightened consciousness of proximity and touch. When Caleb's hand brushed hers, reaching for the sugar, electricity seemed to arc between them. When Eliza leaned past him to get the bread, his sharp intake of breath told her he felt it too, this new dimension to their connection. Over breakfast, they talked carefully around the enormity of what had shifted between them, discussing the day's work and the weather with determined normalcy. But beneath the surface, conversation ran an undercurrent of something deeper, a shared understanding that everything was different now, even if the daily rhythms remained the same. I need to ride out to the north pasture today, Caleb said, finishing his coffee. Check on the herd, mend some fence. I'll be gone most of the day. I'll manage here. Eliza hesitated, then reached across the table to touch his hand. Be careful. His fingers curled around hers, warm and solid. Always am. But it means something, hearing you say it. After he left, Eliza threw herself into work with renewed energy. She finished the washing, tended the garden, made bread, and set it to rise. But her mind kept wandering to Caleb, to the careful way he'd held her the night before, to the future that suddenly seemed possible where before there had been only uncertainty. She was pulling weeds from the vegetable patch when she heard horses approaching. Looking up, she saw two riders coming down the path toward the house. Men she didn't recognize, both rough-looking and travel-worn. Unease prickled down her spine. Eliza stood, brushing dirt from her hands, as the men dismounted. The taller of the two, a man with a scar running through his left eyebrow, touched his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than courtesy. Afternoon, ma'am. We're looking for Caleb Turner. He around? He's out working the ranch, Eliza said, keeping her voice steady. Can I give him a message? The second man, stockier with a week's worth of beard, looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. Pretty thing to have keeping house. Turner always did have good taste. I asked if there was a message I could deliver, Eliza said more firmly. If not, I'll have to ask you to leave. Mr. Turner doesn't appreciate unexpected visitors. Scarface smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Now that's interesting because we have business with Turner. Been riding 2 days to get here. Name's Jack Ridley, and this is my associate, Pete. We used to work cattle with Turner, back before he got all respectable with his own spread. Something in the way he said respectable carried an edge. Eliza took a step back toward the house, calculating distances. If she could get inside, she could bolt the door, maybe get to the rifle Caleb kept above the mantel. I'm sure Mr. Turner will be happy to discuss old times when he returns this evening. You're welcome to wait in town and come back tomorrow. Oh, I don't think we'll be doing that. Ridley took a step closer. See, Turner owes us. We did some work for him a few years back and he never paid up. We've come to collect. Eliza's mind raced. Caleb had never mentioned owing anyone money, and she'd been managing his accounts for weeks now. There were no mysterious debts, no unpaid obligations. These men were lying, which meant they were here for some other purpose entirely. Mr. Turner's financial affairs are in perfect order, she said, edging closer to the porch steps. I keep his books, and there are no outstanding debts. You've been misinformed. Pete laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. You hear that, Jack? The lady keeps his books. Ain't that sweet? He moved to block her path to the house. Why don't we wait inside with you, ma'am? Have some of that coffee I can smell. Make ourselves comfortable until Turner gets back. Fear lanced through Eliza, sharp and cold. She was alone, miles from town, with two men whose intentions were clearly not honorable. But she'd survived worse than intimidation. She'd survived loss and grief and starting over from nothing. She wouldn't let fear make her helpless. Gentlemen, she said, her voice dropping to ice, I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish here, but I can tell you right now that Mr. Turner will not take kindly to you threatening his household. And if you take one step closer to me or this house, you'll regret it. Ridley's smile widened. Big words for a woman alone. What exactly are you going to do about it? She's not alone. The voice came from behind the men, low and deadly calm. Eliza's heart leaped as Caleb stepped into view from the side of the barn, rifle in hand and pointed squarely at Ridley's chest. He must have seen the stranger's horses and approached carefully, assessing the situation before revealing himself. Both men spun around, hands moving toward their own weapons, but Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't even think about it. I've got you both covered, and I don't miss at this range." Ridley's hand slowly moved away from his gun belt, but his expression remained defiant. "Well now, Turner, that's a hell of a greeting for old friends." "We were never friends, Ridley, and you've got about 10 seconds to explain what you're doing on my property before I decide you're trespassing with ill intent." Caleb's voice was flat and hard, nothing like the gentle tones Eliza had grown accustomed to. This was a different man, or rather, a different aspect of the same man, one forged by harder times than ranch management. "Just came to talk business," Ridley said, though his eyes kept flicking between Caleb and Eliza. "Maybe collect what we're owed." "You're owed nothing. We rode together for one season 5 years back, and I paid you fair wages for fair work. That account's closed." Caleb took a step forward, the rifle never wavering. "So here's how this is going to go. You're going to mount up, ride out, and never set foot on my land again. And if I hear you've been spreading lies in town about debts or anything else, I'll make sure the sheriff knows you came here to threaten a woman while I was out working." Pete's hand twitched toward his gun. "You threatening us, Turner?" "No threat, just facts. Now move." For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Ridley spat in the dirt and gestured to Pete. "Come on, this ain't worth it. But Turner?" His eyes went to Eliza, cold and calculating. "You might want to keep a closer eye on your pretty housekeeper. Accidents happen out in the territory. Would be a shame if something happened to her." The rifle barrel shifted fractionally, now aimed directly at Ridley's head. "That," Caleb said softly, "is the last time you mention her, ever. Now get off my land before I forget I'm a civilized man." The two men mounted their horses, but slowly, making it clear they were leaving by choice rather than compulsion. As they rode away, Ridley called back over his shoulder, "This ain't over, Turner." "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "It is." They waited in tense silence until the riders disappeared over the rise. Only then did Caleb lower the rifle, his shoulders sagging slightly as tension drained out of him. He turned to Eliza, and she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "Are you all right? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine." Eliza's hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, but she kept her voice steady. "They were trying to intimidate me, but you arrived before things went further." Caleb set the rifle down and crossed to her in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that surprised them both. "I saw their horses and came back as fast as I could. If anything had happened to you, it didn't." Eliza wrapped her arms around him, feeling his heart racing against her cheek. "I'm all right. We're all right." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other as the afternoon sun beat down and the chickens went back to their scratching as if nothing momentous had just occurred. Finally, Caleb pulled back enough to look at her face. "I need to tell you about Ridley, about that time in my life, so you understand what just happened." "All right." Eliza took his hand and led him to the porch steps. They sat side by side, and she waited while he gathered his thoughts. "I wasn't always a rancher," Caleb began, his voice low. "Before Rebecca and I saved enough to buy this land, I worked cattle drives, hired myself out to whoever needed hands. It was hard, brutal work, months on the trail, sleeping rough, fighting weather and rustlers, and sometimes the men you rode with. Jack Ridley was on one of those drives. He was mean even then, quick with his fists and quicker to take offense. But he knew cattle, so the boss kept him on." He paused, watching the horizon where Ridley and Pete had disappeared. "There was a girl at one of the towns we passed through, maybe 17, working at a boarding house. Ridley took a liking to her, but she wanted nothing to do with him. One night he got drunk and tried to force himself on her. I stopped him, and we fought. I won, but I made an enemy that day." Eliza squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing." "Maybe, but Ridley's the kind who never forgets a slight, real or imagined. After that drive ended, I heard he'd fallen in with some rough types, rustlers, claim jumpers, men who take what they want and don't care who gets hurt. I thought he'd forgotten about me, or at least let it go. But clearly, I was wrong. Do you think he'll come back?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know. Men like Ridley, they're unpredictable. He might decide I'm not worth the trouble, or he might nurse this grudge and come back when I least expect it. He turned to face her fully. Which is why I need you to promise me something. If you ever see him, or anyone like him around when I'm not here, you get inside, bolt the door, and get the rifle. Don't try to be brave, don't try to handle it yourself. Just protect yourself until I can get back. I can protect myself, Eliza said, some steel entering her voice. I'm not helpless, Caleb. I know you're not. But these aren't men who play by rules or respect women's courage. They're predators, and His voice broke slightly. I can't lose you. Not now. Not when I've just found you. The raw emotion in his words melted Eliza's defensiveness. She leaned against him, fitting herself into the curve of his shoulder. You won't lose me. But you have to promise me something, too. Don't keep things from me to protect me. If there's danger, I need to know so I can be prepared. Deal. Caleb kissed the top of her head, a gesture so tender it made Eliza's throat tight. Come on, let's get inside. I want to check all the locks and make sure everything's secure. The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of normal routine and heightened vigilance. Caleb checked every window, every door, made sure the rifle was loaded and within easy reach. He brought in extra firewood, filled water barrels, prepared the ranch as if for siege. Eliza watched him work, understanding that this was how he dealt with fear, through action, through preparation, through taking control of what he could control. That evening, they sat together in the gathering dusk, the kerosene lamp burning low on the table between them. Neither was hungry despite the meal Eliza had prepared. The day's events had shaken something loose in both of them, exposed vulnerabilities, revealed depths of feeling that were both thrilling and terrifying. I don't want you to be afraid here, Caleb said finally. This was supposed to be a safe place for you. I'm not afraid, Eliza said, and realized it was true. Worried, maybe. Cautious. But not afraid. Because you're here, and I trust you. Trust is a big word. It's the right word. Eliza reached across the table and took his hand. I trust you to keep me safe. I trust you to be honest with me. And I trust what I feel for you, even though it happened faster than I expected and in ways I didn't plan. Caleb's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. I keep thinking about what Ridley said, about accidents happening, and I realize that I can't protect you from everything. There's always going to be some risk, some danger I can't predict or prevent. But Eliza, I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe, and I will never take for granted what you've given me by staying here, by choosing to trust me, by... He swallowed hard. By loving me, if that's truly what you feel. It is. The words came easily, without hesitation. I love you, Caleb Turner. I didn't mean to, didn't plan for it, but I do. He stood abruptly, circled the table, and pulled her to her feet. His kiss was different this time, not gentle and tentative, but fierce and claiming, full of all the fear and relief and desperate hope he couldn't put into words. Eliza kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring everything she felt into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I love you too. Have for weeks, maybe. And I know it's fast, know we should probably take more time, but Eliza... He pulled back to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the lamplight. I don't want to wait. I don't want to spend another day pretending this is just an arrangement or a courtship that might or might not lead somewhere. I want a future with you, a real one. Eliza's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying marry me. The words tumbled out rough and unpolished, nothing like a romantic proposal but utterly sincere. I know I'm not much, just a rancher with a modest spread and a past that includes men like Ridley. But I promise you this, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes. I will work to give you the kind of life you deserve. I will be faithful and honest and whatever else you need me to be. Just say you'll marry me, Eliza. Say you'll stay. Tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She'd come to Colorado expecting one kind of future and found something infinitely better. A man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. A life that was harder, but more real than anything she'd known. A love that had grown from shared work and quiet conversations into something unshakable. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle while she clung to him and laughed through her tears. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools. I don't have a ring, he said. I don't have much of anything to offer you except myself and this ranch, and a promise that I'll love you for the rest of my life. That's enough. Eliza cupped his face in her hands. That's more than enough. I don't need rings or grand gestures. I just need you. They stayed up late that night, making plans. They'd go to town on Saturday and speak to the preacher, arrange for a simple ceremony. Martha and the other women would help with preparations. It would be nothing fancy. Eliza had already had a wedding dress packed away in her trunk. After all, just a gathering of the community to witness their vows. Do you mind that it's so simple? Caleb asked at one point, clearly worried he was shortchanging her somehow. Mind? Eliza shook her head. Caleb, I came here for a marriage to a man I'd never met, planning a wedding to create the appearance of respectability. This is real. You're real. What we feel for each other is real. That's worth more than all the fancy ceremonies in the world. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, they sat together on the old settee Rebecca had chosen years before. And if there was any ghost of the past lingering in that house, Eliza thought it was a gentle one, glad to see life and love returning to rooms that had been empty too long. Finally, reluctantly, they parted for their separate rooms. But at her door, Caleb caught her hand one more time. Thank you, he said softly, for seeing something worth staying for in all this, for taking a chance on a quiet rancher who didn't even know how much he needed you until you were here. Thank you, Eliza countered, for offering me a place when I had nowhere to go, for showing me that sometimes the life you think you've lost is just making room for the life you were always meant to have. Sleep came slowly that night, Eliza's mind too full of plans and possibilities to settle easily into rest. But when she finally drifted off, it was with a smile on her face and hope in her heart, the kind of hope she'd thought she'd lost forever on that dusty train platform months ago. The next morning brought news that tested that newfound hope. Caleb came in from his early chores with a grim expression, a piece of paper clutched in his hand. Found this tacked to the barn door. Eliza took it, her hands suddenly cold. The message was scrawled in rough handwriting. You made your choice, Turner. Now you'll live with the consequences. She won't always have you there to protect her. Ridley, she said quietly. Has to be. Caleb's jaw was tight. I'm riding to town to talk to the sheriff. This is a direct threat, and I won't stand for it. I'm coming with you. Eliza, I'm coming with you, she repeated firmly. I won't sit here wondering and worrying. We're in this together now, remember? Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Together. You're right. Get ready. We'll leave within the hour. The ride to town was tense, both of them scanning the landscape for any sign of riders or ambush. But they reached Miller's Crossing without incident and went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Morrison was a grizzled man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened carefully as Caleb explained the situation, examined the threatening note, and asked pointed questions about Ridley's past and current whereabouts. I know Jack Ridley, Morrison said finally. Mean son of a bitch, pardon my language, ma'am. He's been suspected in a few cattle rustling operations, but nothing we could prove. If he's making threats against you and Miss Moore, that's a different matter. He looked at Eliza. You planning to stay at Turner's ranch? I am, Eliza said. We're engaged to be married. Morrison's eyebrows rose, but he nodded approvingly. Congratulations. That changes things legally, gives you more standing to defend the property as a unit. But it also means you're both at risk if Ridley decides to escalate. He turned back to Caleb. I'll put out word that I'm looking for Ridley. Ask around if anyone's seen him. But Turner, you need to be realistic. I can't station a deputy at your ranch. And these kinds of men, they're like wolves. Patient. They wait for the right moment. So what do we do? Eliza asked. Be vigilant. Don't go anywhere alone. Keep weapons accessible. And if Ridley or any of his associates show up again, you defend yourselves and then you come tell me. Colorado law allows for defense of property and person. Morrison's expression softened slightly. I know it's not the answer you want, but it's the best I can offer. They left the sheriff's office with heavy hearts, but stopped to see Martha Yates before heading home. She was delighted by their engagement news and immediately began planning, rattling off lists of what would need to be done for even a simple ceremony. But when Caleb mentioned Ridley, her face grew serious. "I've heard of him," she said quietly. "He's bad business, Caleb. You need to be careful, both of you." "We will be," Eliza assured her, "but we're not letting him dictate how we live our lives." "Good for you." Martha squeezed her hand. "That's the spirit. You stand your ground and build your life together. Don't let fear steal your joy." On the ride home, Eliza leaned against Caleb's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Are you sorry?" she asked quietly. "That I came here and brought complications with me?" "What?" "No." Caleb's arm tightened around her. "Eliza, you didn't bring Ridley. He's part of my past, not yours. And even if you had brought complications, which you didn't, it would be worth it. You're worth anything." They spent the rest of the week fortifying the ranch and preparing for the wedding. Caleb taught Eliza to shoot, standing behind her at the makeshift range he set up, his hands guiding hers on the rifle. She proved a decent shot after some practice, and seeing her handle a weapon with growing confidence eased some of Caleb's worry. In quiet moments, they talked about their future, about expanding the herd, maybe building an addition to the house, about the children they might have someday. It felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, this planning for a life together. But with each conversation, each shared dream, the foundation of their partnership grew stronger. Saturday arrived clear and beautiful, perfect weather for a wedding. Martha and several other women from town arrived early to help Eliza prepare, bringing wildflowers for a bouquet and ribbons for her hair. The ceremony would be simple, held at the church with the community invited to witness their vows, followed by a modest celebration at the town hall. Eliza stood in the small room behind the church, looking at herself in the borrowed mirror. She wore the cream silk wedding dress she'd brought from Boston, the one she'd thought she'd wear to marry Samuel Brennan. But somehow it felt right to wear it now, a symbol of how far she'd come, how radically her life had transformed. Martha bustled in, saw her standing there, and smiled. "You look beautiful, dear. Caleb's a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Eliza said softly. "I came here with nothing and found everything." That's how it works sometimes in this territory. We lose what we thought we wanted and find what we actually needed. Martha adjusted Eliza's veil. "You ready?" Eliza took a deep breath, steadied herself. "I'm ready." The church was small, but filled with faces that had become familiar over the past months. Henderson and his wife Clara, Miss Bloom, the schoolteacher, the Thorntons, and dozens of others. They'd come to witness this unlikely union between the quiet rancher and the mail-order bride who never made it to her intended groom. But when Eliza walked down that short aisle and saw Caleb waiting for her at the altar, saw the love and wonder in his eyes as he watched her approach, she knew without doubt that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The preacher's words washed over her, solemn promises about love and fidelity, about facing life's trials together, about the sacred bond of marriage. And when it came time for their vows, Caleb took her hands in his and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the small church. "I promise to love you every day for the rest of my life, to protect you, provide for you, and walk beside you through whatever comes. You came into my life when I'd stopped believing I deserved a second chance at happiness. You proved me wrong, and I will spend forever being grateful for that." Eliza's voice shook only slightly as she made her own promises. "I came here lost and afraid, and you offered me shelter without asking anything in return. You showed me kindness when I needed it most, and then you showed me love. I promise to be your partner in all things, to build a life with you, to choose you every day for as long as we both shall live." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with tenderness and joy, and the small congregation erupted in applause. They walked back down the aisle together, hands clasped tight, husband and wife, partners for whatever came next. At the celebration afterward, as they danced and accepted congratulations, Eliza caught Caleb's eye and smiled. He smiled back, and in that moment, surrounded by community and wrapped in love, Eliza felt something settle deep in her soul. She'd arrived too late to marry Samuel Brennan, but she'd arrived exactly on time to find Caleb Turner and a love that was real and true and worth every hardship that had brought her here. The celebration continued late into the evening, but eventually the newlyweds made their farewells and climbed into the wagon for the ride home. The moon hung full and bright overhead, turning the familiar landscape silver and strange. Eliza sat close to Caleb, her hand resting on his thigh, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his wedding clothes. "Mrs. Turner," he said softly, testing the name. "How does it sound?" "Like home," Eliza replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The ranch appeared peaceful as they approached, lamplight from their earlier preparations still glowing faintly in the windows. Caleb helped Eliza down from the wagon with particular care, as if she were made of something precious and breakable. But when her feet touched the ground, he didn't release her. Instead, he swept her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" Eliza laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Carrying my bride over the threshold. It's tradition." His smile was tender in the moonlight. "And I figure we should start this marriage with at least one tradition, even if nothing else about how we got here was traditional." He carried her up the porch steps and through the door, setting her down gently in the main room. The house felt different somehow, not just the familiar space where she'd worked and lived for months, but truly theirs now. Their home, their life, their future. Caleb lit the lamp on the table, and warm light filled the room. He turned to face her, suddenly looking uncertain in a way that was endearing coming from a man who'd faced down armed threats without flinching. "I know we've been living under the same roof for months," he said quietly, "but this is different. You're my wife now, and I want to do right by you. So if you need time, if you want to—" Eliza crossed to him and placed her fingers gently over his lips, silencing him the way she had that night weeks ago when he'd confessed his feelings. "I don't need time. I need you. I chose you, Caleb, and I'm choosing you again right now." His kiss was answer and question both, gentle at first and then deepening as weeks of restrained longing finally found release. They made their way to the bedroom, no longer just Caleb's room but theirs, helping each other with buttons and laces, discovering each other with reverence and joy. Later, lying in the darkness with Caleb's arm around her and her head on his chest, Eliza felt a peace she'd never known. The journey that had brought her here had been painful and uncertain, but it had led to this moment, this man, this life. She wouldn't change any of it. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his voice rumbling under her ear. "That I'm grateful," she said softly, "for everything that happened, even the hard parts, because they brought me here." His arm tightened around her. "I know what you mean. Losing Rebecca nearly broke me. But if I hadn't walked through that grief, I wouldn't have been the man you needed when you arrived. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are what prepare us for the best things." They talked long into the night, sharing dreams and fears, making plans for their future. Caleb wanted to expand the herd, maybe hire permanent hands to help with the work. Eliza wanted to start a small library in town, share some of her books from Boston with others who might appreciate them. They talked about children, how many they might want, what kind of parents they hoped to be. "I want them to know they're loved," Eliza said. "Not just in words, but in actions, the way my parents loved me, and the way you love me." "They will," Caleb promised. "Any children we have will never doubt for a moment that they're wanted and cherished." Sleep finally claimed them near dawn, wrapped in each other's arms and dreaming of the future they would build together. The first weeks of marriage brought adjustments both small and significant. The house felt fuller now, as if the legal acknowledgement of their bond had somehow given them permission to truly share space. Caleb no longer knocked before entering rooms, and Eliza grew accustomed to his presence in ways both mundane and intimate. They developed new rhythms, waking together, working in tandem, ending each day in the same bed rather than retreating to separate quarters. But the shadow of Jack Ridley's threat hung over their happiness like a storm cloud that refused to break. Caleb insisted Eliza never venture far from the house alone, and he arranged his work so he was never gone for more than a few hours at a time. It chafed at both of them, this constraint born of fear and caution, but neither was willing to take unnecessary risks. 3 weeks after the wedding, the tension finally broke. Eliza was working in the garden, pulling weeds from between the tomato plants, when she heard horses approaching fast. Her heart jumped into her throat as she grabbed the small pistol Caleb had insisted she keep with her and ran toward the house. But before she could reach the porch, she recognized one of the riders, Sheriff Morrison, with 2 deputies flanking him. Caleb emerged from the barn at a run, rifle in hand, but lowered it when he saw who'd arrived. "Sheriff, what's happened?" Morrison dismounted, his expression grim. "We found Ridley, or rather, he found us. Tried to rustle cattle from the Henderson spread last night. We caught him red-handed, and when we went to bring him in, he and his men put up a fight." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Pete's dead. Ridley's wounded and in custody, along with 2 others." Eliza felt her knees go weak with relief. Caleb was beside her in an instant, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. "So it's over?" Caleb asked, his voice carefully controlled. "For now. Ridley will hang for rustling and for killing one of my deputies in the shootout. The other 2 will likely spend the rest of their lives in prison." Morrison's expression softened as he looked at Eliza. "You can rest easy, Mrs. Turner. That particular threat is done." After the sheriff and his men left, Eliza and Caleb stood together in the yard, processing the news. The relief was immense, but it came tangled with other emotions. Regret that violence had been necessary, sadness for lives wasted on anger and greed, gratitude that the threat had ended before anyone they loved had been hurt. "We're safe now," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to her. "You're safe." "We both are." Eliza turned in his arms to face him. "And now we can truly start building our life without looking over our shoulders." That night, they celebrated their freedom quietly. A good meal, conversation that ranged freely without the undercurrent of worry, and the simple joy of being together without fear. It felt like a new beginning, a second fresh start in a journey that had been full of unexpected turns. The rest of summer passed in a golden haze of work and contentment. The cattle thrived, the garden produced abundantly, and the ranch took on the well-tended look of a place truly loved. Eliza established her small lending library in town, donating books from her trunk and acquiring others through trades and purchases. The women of Miller's Crossing became true friends, gathering weekly for coffee and conversation at various homes. In late August, Eliza realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she told herself it was stress or the physical demands of ranch work, but when a second month passed and she began feeling queasy in the mornings, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She'd always wanted children. But the practical reality of pregnancy and childbirth in this remote place suddenly felt overwhelming. Women died in childbirth here, far from doctors and hospitals. What if something went wrong? What if she couldn't? She forced herself to stop that line of thinking and focus on the present moment. She was healthy, strong from months of ranch work, and she had Caleb. They would face this together, just as they'd faced everything else. Telling Caleb proved both easier and harder than she'd anticipated. She waited until evening, until they were sitting together after supper, and then simply said the words. "I'm pregnant." Caleb went very still. His coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth, and for a long moment he just stared at her. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not his usual small, controlled expression, but a grin of pure, unguarded joy. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing the word. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I think we're going to have a baby." Caleb set down his cup very carefully, then crossed to her and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Eliza, my Eliza, this is—" His voice broke. "This is everything I didn't know I still wanted. A family, a real family." She touched his face, feeling the dampness on his cheeks, and realizing he was crying. "You're happy then?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with exquisite gentleness, as if she might break. "I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once. Are you all right? Do you feel well? Should you be working so hard? We need to—" Eliza laughed through her own tears. "Caleb, breathe. I'm fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, and most of them while doing far more strenuous work than I do. I'll be careful, but I won't be fragile. This baby is going to be born strong, just like its parents." Over the following weeks, Caleb became almost comically protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy lifting, forbade her from climbing ladders, and watched her like a hawk whenever she was near anything potentially dangerous. Eliza bore his concern with patience and occasional exasperation, understanding that it came from love even when it felt suffocating. Martha was delighted by the news and became an invaluable source of practical advice. She delivered 6 children of her own and assisted with countless others, and her no-nonsense approach to pregnancy helped calm Eliza's fears. "You're healthy and young," Martha said over coffee one afternoon, "and you've got good hips. Pardon my bluntness. You'll do fine when the time comes. Just eat well, get rest, and don't let Caleb wrap you in cotton wool." "Easier said than done," Eliza said ruefully. "Yesterday, he wouldn't let me carry a basket of laundry because it was too heavy." Martha laughed. "That's men for you. They feel helpless about the whole process, so they try to control what they can. Just pat his hand and do what you need to do when he's not looking." As autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods gold and filling the air with the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves, Eliza felt herself settling even more deeply into her life at the ranch. Her body changed, her waist thickened, her breasts grew tender, and eventually she could feel the flutter of movement inside her that meant the baby was real and alive and growing. Caleb took to talking to her belly in the evenings, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and making promises about the life they would build together. It was sweet and ridiculous and so perfectly him that Eliza fell in love with him all over again watching it. But their peaceful existence was interrupted one October morning when a wagon pulled up to the ranch carrying a woman Eliza had never seen before. She was perhaps 35, dressed in clothing that had once been fine but showed signs of hard travel, and she carried herself with a strange mixture of dignity and desperation. Caleb emerged from the barn and stopped short when he saw her, his face going pale. "Sarah?" "Hello, Caleb." The woman's voice was soft, cultured. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced. I didn't know where else to go." Eliza joined Caleb, her hand instinctively going to her rounded belly. She felt him tense beside her, saw the conflict in his expression, and knew without being told that this woman's arrival meant complications. "Eliza," Caleb said carefully, "this is Sarah Brennan. She's Samuel's widow." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Samuel Brennan, the man Eliza was supposed to have married, the man whose death had led to everything that followed. And this was his widow, appearing at their door months after his death. "Mrs. Brennan," Eliza said, recovering her composure. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Please, come inside. You must be exhausted from traveling." Sarah's eyes went to Eliza's belly, and something complicated crossed her face. Grief, perhaps, or envy, or simple sadness for what she'd lost. "Thank you. That's kind of you, Mrs. Turner." Inside, over coffee and the bread Eliza had baked that morning, Sarah told her story. Samuel Brennan had sent for a mail-order bride without telling his wife who'd been away in Denver caring for her dying mother. When Sarah had returned to find her husband dead and a young woman from Boston due to arrive any day, she'd panicked and left town, unable to face the situation. "I've been living with my sister in Denver," Sarah said, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "But she's fallen on hard times, and I need to return to Miller's Crossing to settle Samuel's affairs. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. You were as much a victim of Samuel's deception as I was. But I don't know anyone else in town, and I thought perhaps—" "You need help," Eliza finished quietly, "and you're asking for it." "Yes," Sarah met her eyes directly. "I know it's awkward. I know seeing me must bring up complicated feelings. But I'm desperate, Mrs. Turner. I have nowhere else to turn." Eliza looked at Caleb, saw him watching her carefully, leaving the decision in her hands. This was her choice to make, whether to help the widow of the man she'd been meant to marry, the man whose death had inadvertently brought her to Caleb. She thought about arriving at that train platform months ago, desperate and alone with nowhere to go. She thought about Caleb's offer of help when he'd had no obligation to give it. She thought about this community that had welcomed her, the friends who'd supported her, the radical generosity that had transformed her life. "You can stay here," Eliza said firmly. "We have a spare room, and you're welcome to it for as long as you need. We'll help you sort out your husband's affairs and figure out your next steps." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. You don't know what this means. I do, actually. Eliza reached across the table and squeezed the other woman's hand. I know exactly what it means to be lost and have someone offer you shelter. We take care of each other here. That's how it works. That night, after Sarah had retired to the spare room, exhausted from travel and emotion, Eliza and Caleb sat together in their bedroom, processing the day's unexpected development. Are you all right with this? Caleb asked, pulling her close. Having her here, I mean. It's a strange situation. It is, Eliza admitted, but it also feels right. She's a widow who needs help, just like I was a stranger who needed help. How could I turn her away when you showed me such kindness? You're remarkable, you know that? Caleb kissed her forehead. Most women would have refused out of awkwardness or pride or simple self-protection, but you led with compassion. She's suffering, Eliza said simply, and we have the means to ease that suffering. It's not complicated. But over the following days, the situation proved more complicated than Eliza had anticipated. Sarah was grateful and helpful, assisting with household tasks and proving herself a skilled seamstress and cook. But her presence was a constant reminder of the path not taken, of the life Eliza might have lived if Samuel Brennan hadn't died. More challenging was watching Sarah grieve, not just for her husband, but for the future she'd lost. She was childless and would likely remain so, her chances of remarrying in this harsh place limited by her age and circumstances. And seeing Eliza pregnant, building the life Sarah would never have, clearly caused her pain she tried hard to hide. One afternoon, Eliza found Sarah sitting alone in the spare room, holding a small dress she'd been sewing. For the baby, Sarah said quietly, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. I thought perhaps you could use it. I have some skill with a needle, and I wanted to contribute something. The dress was beautiful, tiny, and perfect, made with obvious care. Eliza took it gently, feeling the weight of all the complicated emotions tangled up in this simple garment. Thank you, she said softly. This is lovely. But Sarah, are you sure you want to do this? I know it must be hard being here and seeing what I'll never have, Sarah finished. Yes, it's hard. But Mrs. Turner, Eliza, your kindness has given me something I desperately needed. Not just shelter, but hope. Watching you and Caleb together, seeing the life you're building, it reminds me that good things can come from terrible circumstances. That maybe there's still a future for me too, even if it looks different than I'd planned. Eliza sat down beside her, the tiny dress cradled in her hands. I'm sorry for what you've lost, and I'm sorry that my happiness might be painful for you to witness. Don't be, Sarah managed to smile. Your happiness isn't something to apologize for. It's something to celebrate. And maybe, by helping you prepare for this baby, I can be part of something good. Part of a life beginning instead of dwelling on the life that ended. Over the next weeks, the two women developed an unlikely friendship. Sarah proved invaluable as Eliza's pregnancy advanced, helping with tasks that became increasingly difficult, sharing knowledge about childbirth and infant care, preparing clothes and blankets for the coming baby. And slowly, through shared work and quiet conversation, they helped each other heal. Sarah from her loss, Eliza from the lingering guilt she felt about finding joy from circumstances that had caused Sarah pain. In early November, they traveled to town together to help Sarah settle Samuel's affairs. The process was complicated. There were debts to resolve, property to dispose of, legal documents to sign. But with Caleb's help and support from the community, they navigated the bureaucracy and emerged with Sarah's situation clarified. Samuel had left little, a few personal effects, a small savings account, and a piece of land outside town that had never been developed. Sarah decided to sell the land and use the proceeds to open a small shop in Miller's Crossing, selling the beautiful clothes and quilts she made. I won't be rich, she told Eliza over tea one afternoon, but I'll be independent. I can support myself and build a life on my own terms. That's more than many women have. It's more than I would have had if Caleb hadn't offered me a place here, Eliza said. We're both building new lives from the ashes of what we lost. There's strength in that. By late November, Sarah had secured a small storefront and was preparing to move into the rooms above it. The night before she left the ranch, the three of them, Caleb, Eliza, and Sarah, sat together after supper, and Sarah raised her coffee cup in a toast. To new beginnings, she said, and to the kindness of strangers who become friends. You've given me more than shelter, Caleb and Eliza. You've given me hope and purpose and the courage to start over. I'll never forget that. To new beginnings, Eliza echoed, touching her cup to Sarah's, and to the community that holds us all. After Sarah left, the house felt quieter, but somehow fuller, as if the complicated emotions of the past weeks had deepened rather than diminished the sense of home. Eliza stood in the spare room, now empty again, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Boston to a dusty train platform, from desperation to employment, from friendship to love, from stranger to wife to expectant mother. And now, with winter approaching and her baby growing inside her, she felt ready for the next chapter. Ready to become a mother, ready to raise children in this harsh, beautiful place, ready to build the life she and Caleb had promised each other. She found him in the barn, checking on the horses before the cold weather truly set in. He looked up as she entered, and his face softened with love. "You all right?" he asked, crossing to her. "You've been quiet since Sarah left." "I'm good," Eliza said, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. How much has changed since I stepped off that train. Any regrets?" "Not one." She looked up at him, this man who'd offered her shelter and given her love, who'd chosen her every day since that first uncertain beginning. "I arrived too late to marry Samuel Brennan, but I arrived exactly on time to find you, and that makes all the difference." Caleb kissed her, slow and sweet, one hand resting gently on her rounded belly where their child grew. "I love you, Eliza Turner, more than I thought possible." "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "And I choose you. Every day, for the rest of my life, I choose you." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the ranch in white and promising the quiet beauty of the season to come. But inside the barn, wrapped in each other's arms, Eliza and Caleb stood warm and certain, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something real from loss and hope and love. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, and they would face it together, choosing each other again and again with every sunrise. Winter settled over the ranch with a quiet intensity that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and unforgiving. Snow blanketed the valley in white, and the cottonwoods stood bare and skeletal against skies that shifted from brilliant blue to heavy gray depending on the weather's mood. Eliza watched the season change from the warmth of the house, her belly now round and heavy with the child she would meet in early spring. The pregnancy had been easier than she'd feared, but harder than she'd hoped. Her back ached constantly, her feet swelled, and simple tasks that had once been effortless now left her breathless. But Caleb was there for every moment, rubbing her feet in the evenings, helping her dress when buttons became unreachable, bringing her tea and warmth and steady reassurance that everything would be all right. "You're coddling me," she said one December evening as he adjusted pillows behind her back for the third time. "I'm caring for my wife," he corrected, kissing her forehead. "There's a difference." "Is there?" But Eliza smiled, loving him for his devotion, even when it bordered on excessive. Martha visited weekly, checking on Eliza's progress and offering advice drawn from years of experience. She brought practical gifts, soft flannel for diapers, a cradle that had rocked her own children, herbs for making tea that would help with milk production after the birth. "You're doing fine," Martha said during one visit in late December, her experienced hands examining Eliza's belly. "Baby's positioned well, good and strong from what I can feel. Another few weeks and you'll be holding this little one." "I'm scared," Eliza admitted quietly, something she hadn't said to Caleb for fear of worrying him further. "What if something goes wrong? What if I can't?" "Every woman feels that fear," Martha interrupted gently. "It's natural. But Eliza, you're strong. You survived losing your parents, traveled across the country alone, built a life in a place you'd never seen. You can do this too. And you won't be alone. I'll be with you every step of the way." The reassurance helped, but the fear remained a constant companion through the short winter days and long nights. Eliza found herself lying awake sometimes, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby move and wondering what kind of mother she would be. Would she know what to do? Would she be enough? Caleb seemed to sense her midnight worries without her speaking them aloud. He would pull her close, one large hand covering hers on her belly, and whisper stories about the future, about teaching their child to ride, about family dinners around the table, about the love that would surround this baby from its first breath. "We'll figure it out together," he said one particularly sleepless night. "Just like we figured out everything else. You and me, Eliza. We're a team." Christmas came quietly to the ranch. They had no decorations beyond some pine boughs Caleb cut and arranged on the mantel, no gifts beyond the mittens Eliza had knitted for Caleb and the rocking chair he'd built for her in secret. But when they sat together on Christmas evening, the fire crackling and snow falling softly outside, Eliza felt a contentment that had nothing to do with material things and everything to do with love. "This time last year, I was alone in Boston, planning a wedding to a man I'd never met," she said softly. "I couldn't have imagined this. Any of this. I was alone here, convinced I'd spend the rest of my life that way." Caleb's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Funny how life works, how the worst things can lead to the best things if you're brave enough to keep going." January brought bitter cold and storms that lasted for days, trapping them inside with nothing to do but tend the fire, care for the animals in quick trips to the barn, and wait for the weather to break. Eliza grew increasingly uncomfortable, the baby pressing on her lungs and making sleep difficult. She spent hours in the rocking chair Caleb had made, knitting tiny clothes and imagining the child who would wear them. On a gray afternoon in late January, Eliza felt the first contraction. It was subtle at first, just a tightening across her belly that might have been nothing. But when it came again 20 minutes later, stronger this time, she knew. "Caleb," she called, keeping her voice calm despite the sudden surge of fear and excitement. "I think it's time." He was at her side in seconds, his face pale but determined. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Another contraction gripped her, and she breathed through it the way Martha had taught her. "You need to go get Martha, now." The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain and effort and waiting. Caleb rode through the snow to fetch Martha, leaving Eliza alone for what felt like an eternity but was probably less than an hour. She paced the house, gripping furniture when contractions hit, trying to remember everything Martha had told her about breathing and pushing and letting her body do what it was designed to do. When Martha finally arrived, snow dusting her coat and determination in her eyes, Eliza nearly cried with relief. "All right, dear," Martha said, shrugging out of her coat and immediately taking charge. "Let's get you comfortable and see how far along we are. Caleb, put water on to boil and then make yourself useful elsewhere. This is women's work." Caleb looked torn between obeying and staying, but Eliza managed a smile between contractions. "I'll be fine. Martha's here now. Go." What followed was the hardest physical labor Eliza had ever experienced. The contractions intensified, coming closer and closer together until there was barely time to breathe between them. Martha coached her through each one, her voice steady and confident, wiping Eliza's face with cool cloths and offering sips of water. "You're doing beautifully," Martha said as twilight darkened the windows. "Won't be much longer now. When the next big one comes, you're going to push. Can you do that?" Eliza nodded, too exhausted to speak. The pain was enormous, all-consuming, but beneath it ran a fierce determination. She would do this. She would bring her child into the world through sheer force of will if necessary. When the urge to push finally came, it was overwhelming and instinctive. Eliza bore down with everything she had, distantly aware of Martha's encouraging words and her own involuntary cries. Again and again she pushed, feeling her body stretch and strain in ways that seemed impossible. "I can see the head!" Martha's voice was jubilant. "One more big push, Eliza. Your baby's almost here." Gathering the last reserves of her strength, Eliza pushed with everything she had, and suddenly there was a release, a moment of impossible relief, and then a sound that made her heart stop and restart in the same instant. A baby's cry, indignant and strong, filling the room with life. "It's a girl," Martha announced, tears streaming down her weathered face. "A beautiful, perfect girl." Through her own tears and exhaustion, Eliza saw Martha wrap the baby in soft flannel and bring her close. The infant was tiny and red-faced, her eyes squeezed shut as she wailed her displeasure at being thrust from warm darkness into cold brightness. But she was alive and healthy and absolutely perfect. "Your daughter," Martha said softly, placing the baby in Eliza's arms. The moment the child settled against Eliza's chest, something fundamental shifted in the universe. This was her daughter, her child. The baby she'd carried and worried over and already loved beyond measure. She counted tiny fingers and toes, marveled at the downy dark hair and the small nose that looked exactly like Caleb's. "Hello, little one," Eliza whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm your mama, and I've been waiting so long to meet you." The door burst open and Caleb appeared, his face a mixture of terror and hope. "I heard crying. Is the baby?" "Come meet your daughter," Eliza said, smiling through exhausted tears. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside the bed, staring at the baby in Eliza's arms with absolute wonder. His hand shook as he reached out to touch the tiny head, his eyes flooding with tears. "She's perfect," he breathed. "Eliza, she's perfect. And you did this. You're amazing." "We did this," Eliza corrected softly. "All of it. Together." They named her Rebecca Martha Turner, Rebecca for the woman who'd come before, whose memory Caleb honored but no longer grieved with the sharp edge of fresh loss, and Martha for the friend who'd delivered her safely into the world. Little Rebecca, they called her Becca almost immediately, had Caleb's dark hair and Eliza's determined chin, and from her first moment she made it clear she had opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting beyond anything Eliza had imagined. Becca nursed constantly, slept in unpredictable fits and starts, and required attention every moment she was awake. Eliza moved through those early days in a fog of sleeplessness and overwhelming love, learning to navigate motherhood through trial and error. But she wasn't alone. Caleb was there for every midnight feeding, rocking Becca when Eliza needed to sleep, changing diapers and singing off-key lullabies. Martha visited often, bringing casseroles and practical advice. Sarah stopped by with tiny dresses she'd sewn, her face soft with genuine joy at holding the baby. The community wrapped around them like a warm blanket, bringing food and gifts and the accumulated wisdom of dozens of parents who'd walked this path before. One evening in late February, Eliza sat in her rocking chair with Becca nursing contentedly at her breast while Caleb worked on mending harness by lamplight. Snow was falling again outside, but inside the house was warm and filled with a peace that felt profound. "I've been thinking," Caleb said without looking up from his work, "about expanding the house come spring. Adding another bedroom, maybe a proper parlor. With Becca here and maybe more children in the future, we'll need more space." "More children?" Eliza raised an eyebrow, exhausted enough that the thought was both appealing and terrifying. "Let me recover from this one first." Caleb looked up and grinned. "Fair enough, but someday. I like the idea of this house full of children, full of life and noise and chaos." "Chaos we certainly have already," Eliza said dryly, but her heart warmed at the vision he was painting. A house full of children, holidays celebrated together, a family growing and thriving in this place they'd built from nothing. As winter slowly gave way to spring, life on the ranch settled into new rhythms shaped around Becca's needs. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Caleb began the work of expanding the herd and planning the new addition to the house. Eliza gradually regained her strength, learning to balance motherhood with the other demands of ranch life. One warm afternoon in April, nearly a year after Eliza had first arrived in Miller's Crossing, she walked with Becca to the creek that ran through their property. The baby was strapped securely against her chest in a sling Martha had shown her how to make, sleeping peacefully as Eliza navigated the uneven ground. She found a fallen log and sat, listening to the water rush over stones and watching light filter through the new leaves on the cottonwoods. This place had seemed so foreign when she'd first arrived, harsh and unforgiving, nothing like the ordered world she'd known. But now it felt like home in a way Boston never had. Here, she'd found purpose and partnership, and a love that had transformed her understanding of what life could be. "Your mama came here scared and alone," she told sleeping Becca softly. She thought her life was over, that she'd lost everything that mattered, but she was wrong. She hadn't lost everything, she'd just lost what came before so she could find what came next. The baby stirred against her chest, making small, contented noises. Eliza pressed a kiss to the downy head and continued. "Someday you'll understand that the worst moments can lead to the best ones. That sometimes arriving too late to one thing means arriving exactly on time for something better. Your papa taught me that. This place taught me that, and now I'm teaching it to you." She sat there until the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, then walked slowly back to the house. Caleb was waiting on the porch, and his face lit up when he saw them approaching. "There are my girls," he said, coming down the steps to meet them. "I was getting worried." "We were just talking," Eliza said, letting him help her up the porch steps, "about arrivals and timing and how things work out." Caleb looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "They do work out. Not always the way we planned, but somehow they work out right." That evening, after Becca had been fed and changed and put down in her cradle, Eliza and Caleb stood together at the window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. His arm was around her waist, and she leaned against his solid warmth, feeling safe and loved and exactly where she belonged. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Caleb asked quietly. "About what might have happened if I hadn't offered you work." "Sometimes," Eliza admitted, "but not with regret. Everything that happened, Samuel's death, the fear, the uncertainty, it all led here. To you, to Becca, to this life. I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the hard parts? Especially not the hard parts. They taught me who I am, what I'm capable of, and they brought me to you." She turned in his arms to face him. "I was supposed to marry a stranger and build a life based on letters and desperate hope. Instead, I married my best friend and built a life based on trust and real love. I got so much more than I ever could have imagined." Caleb kissed her, slow and sweet and full of promise. "We both did. And we'll keep building it, year after year, together." Summer arrived with warmth and long days perfect for the work of expanding the house. True to his word, Caleb began construction on the new bedroom and parlor, working evenings and Sundays with help from neighbors who came to lend their hands and share their skills. The community that had welcomed Eliza so generously continued to prove itself through action. Henderson donated lumber at cost. Martha's husband helped with the framing. Even Sarah arrived one Saturday with curtains she'd sewn for the new rooms. By August, the addition was complete, and the house had truly become a home. There was space now for the family to grow, for guests to visit, for the life they were building to expand in whatever directions it chose. On a warm evening in late August, they hosted a celebration, a sort of housewarming mixed with Becca's 6-month milestone. The yard filled with friends and neighbors, children running and playing while adults gathered in clusters to talk and laugh. Martha brought her famous apple pie, Henderson provided fresh beef, and Sarah contributed a cake decorated with careful precision. Eliza stood on the porch watching it all, Becca on her hip babbling happily at the activity. This gathering, this community, this life, it was everything she'd never known she wanted. More than that, it was proof that beauty could emerge from loss, that hope could survive despair, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of lemonade. "About how far we've come," Eliza said, accepting one of the glasses. "About how this time last year, I was just starting to believe that maybe we had a future together. And now look at us. We have a daughter, an expanded house, a thriving ranch, and a community that feels like family." "We've been blessed," Caleb agreed. "But we also worked for it, built it together, piece by piece. That matters." As the sun set and the celebration continued into the evening, Eliza found herself thinking about Samuel Brennan again, not with grief or guilt, but with a kind of gentle acknowledgement. His death had seemed like a tragedy, the final cruel blow in a year of loss. But it had actually been the opening of a door, the first step on a path she never would have chosen, but that had led to everything she now cherished. Later that night, after the guests had departed and Becca was asleep in her cradle, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. She'd been thinking about this for months and now felt like the right time. She wrote carefully, choosing words that honored the truth without dwelling on pain. "I came to Colorado Territory in the summer of 1875, expecting to marry a man I'd never met and build a life from letters and hopeful imagination. Instead, I found myself a widow before I was ever a wife, stranded in a town where I knew no one and had nowhere to go. It should have been the end of my story. Instead, it was the beginning. I met a quiet rancher who offered me work when I needed it most. I found a community that welcomed me when I had no claim on their kindness. I discovered that I was stronger than I'd known, more capable than I'd imagined, and worthy of a love I'd thought was beyond my reach. Now, a year later, I am a wife to a good man, a mother to a beautiful daughter, and a partner in building a life that is richer and more real than anything I could have planned. I arrived too late to marry Samuel Brennan, but I arrived exactly on time for everything else. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her journal, a record for Becca someday when she was old enough to understand. A story of how loss could transform into blessing, how wrong turns could lead to right destinations, how the worst timing could actually be perfect timing in disguise. The years that followed were full of the ordinary joys and challenges of frontier life. The ranch continued to grow, and so did the family. Becca was followed by a son they named James, and then 2 more daughters, Sarah and Margaret. The house expanded again to accommodate them all, and the sound of children's laughter became as much a part of the ranch as the lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. Caleb proved to be the father Eliza had known he would be, patient and loving, firm when necessary, but generous with affection. He taught his children to ride and rope, to read the weather and respect the land, to value honesty and hard work and the bonds of family. Eliza became known in the community not just as Caleb's wife, but as a force in her own right. Her lending library grew into a small schoolhouse where she taught reading and arithmetic to children who had no other access to education. She advocated for better roads, for a doctor to settle permanently in town, for the kinds of improvements that would make frontier life a little less harsh. Through it all, the love between her and Caleb deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, their difficult seasons, their moments of frustration and exhaustion. But they never lost sight of what they'd built together, never took for granted the miracle of having found each other against all odds. Martha grew older but remained a steady presence in their lives, beloved by the Turner children who called her Grandma Martha and sought her out for stories and wisdom. Sarah's shop thrived, and she eventually married a widower who'd moved to town to start a lumber mill. Even Sarah Brennan found her second chance, proving that new beginnings were possible at any age. 20 years after Eliza first stepped off that train in Miller's Crossing, she stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house and looked out over the land she and Caleb had built together. The original modest dwelling had grown into a sprawling homestead, new barns and outbuildings, fenced pastures full of healthy cattle, gardens that produced abundantly under her care. But more than the physical growth, it was the life they'd created that made her heart swell with gratitude. Their children were thriving, Becca now 17 and already catching the eye of the Hendersons' oldest son, James learning the ranch business at Caleb's side, the younger girls still wild and free in the way childhood should be. Caleb came up behind her, his hair now shot through with silver, but his step still steady and strong. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder, and they stood together watching the sunset just as they had so many times before. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked. "Thinking grateful thoughts," Eliza corrected, "about how none of this was what I planned, but it's better than anything I could have imagined." "Any regrets?" It was the same question he'd asked years ago, and her answer remained unchanged. "Not one. I arrived too late to become someone else's wife, but I arrived exactly on time to become yours, to build this life, raise these children, be part of this community. The timing was perfect, even when it seemed all wrong." Caleb turned her in his arms to face him, and even after 20 years of marriage, her heart still quickened at his touch. "I love you, Eliza Turner, every day more than the last." "I love you too," she said, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "Thank you for seeing something worth keeping when I showed up desperate and alone." "Thank you for staying," he countered, "for choosing me, for building this with me, for making my life immeasurably richer than it was before you arrived." As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eliza thought about the girl she'd been, frightened and grieving, stepping off a train into an uncertain future. That girl couldn't have imagined standing here now, surrounded by love and purpose and belonging. But that girl had been braver than she knew. Brave enough to accept help when she needed it, brave enough to stay when leaving would have been easier, brave enough to trust in possibility when certainty had been stripped away. The journey from that dusty platform to this moment had been neither straight nor simple. There had been fear and danger, loss and grief, moments when the future seemed impossibly bleak. But there had also been kindness and community, love and growth, and the steady building of something real and lasting. Eliza had learned that arriving too late could actually mean arriving exactly when you needed to, that wrong turns could lead to right destinations, that the life you think you've lost is sometimes just making room for the life you're meant to have. She'd come to Colorado expecting one future and found another entirely, and she wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here, to this man, this family, this life she'd built from the ruins of other plans. Because sometimes, Eliza thought, as Caleb's arms tightened around her and their children's laughter drifted from inside the house, the best things in life are the ones you never saw coming, the ones that arrive precisely when you need them, disguised as disasters, but actually bearing gifts beyond measure. She'd arrived too late for the marriage she'd traveled west to claim, but she'd arrived right on time for everything that truly mattered, and that made all the difference.